We're live.
All right. Hi, my name is Joe McPhail. I'm the founder of WEquil Capital, and I am very pleased to have my daughter Sume here with me today. This is the first time she's joined a research project with me. It seems fitting because WEquil Capital is starting a new initiative to help investors learn to do high quality professional research. And this initiative is very much inspired by my daughter's school, WEquil School. It's a similar type of model where you turn the process of learning into a process of creation. And so we've already started doing more publishing with mostly adults, but some teenagers in our investing learning community. And so this newsletter that we've restarted is informed by opinions of those in that learning community, although I am the editor. And so the views expressed are those that I am comfortable expressing on behalf of me, but I am not operating on my own, thankfully. And am very pleased to have Sume Liu here with me today to talk about our first publication in many months. So without further ado, if you want to go ahead and take the lead and be my guide, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, I really enjoyed writing this with you, and mostly just learning a lot about what kind of looking at these charts and actually understanding what they mean, and then also all the interconnections between everything else. And that's just really valuable to know how it actually plays into other things and not just a chart on its own isolated. But yeah, so why did you choose to start writing again?
So we started a newsletter at the beginning of the year, and I stopped pushing out new articles because I felt like I was repeating myself. I put out a tweet on December 2nd stating that this could be a sell everything moment. That was a week after Jerome Powell did an about face and became quite hawkish. Interest rates were exceedingly low. And I went on a few different YouTube channels to talk about my views. Those were expressed in one with crypto anxiety. There's another one as well that I shared on Twitter again. And we also have those in a playlist now on our new YouTube channel. But essentially, I was arguing that inflation was going to force higher rates, which would in turn increase yields on bonds. Right? When you increase yields on bonds, bond prices fall. But those higher yields make stocks look relatively less attractive. That was the purpose of this article, was to illustrate that. But essentially, I had made the call, and that's what we've seen play out so far this year. Although things actually got worse than I expected, and that's pretty bad. That was the first time I had ever gone out publicly and said that this could be a sell everything moment. That's a very radical thing to do. That's not something that long-term investors, anybody who's been in this game for a while knows that kind of thing. Usually when you see it, it just screams that somebody doesn't have a lot of experience. But there was a lot going into it. And the big one being that we were experiencing already higher inflation than we'd experienced in well over 35 years. And that alone would be enough to make that sort of call. And so that's what we've seen play out. We've had the largest devaluation of financial assets globally ever on record in the past century. So this first article touched on that.
So, what is the main takeaway you want to convey to our readers?
I think part of this was level setting, because while I do have some new important views to share, that's really why I'm restarting this. Is I think that now, given that you've seen a lot of this play out, you've seen the 10-year treasury bond yield go from, I think at the time of that writing, it was maybe 1.5%. Now it's over 4%. That's a really dramatic move given how low yields were. I wanted to level set with readers that background because it had been a while since publishing anything, and help readers understand why everything was falling together, right? Because that is very atypical. For the past few decades, when stock prices fell, it was usually in response to growth concerns. And so investors would flee to bonds because in bonds would pay that fixed coupon payment, and the fall in growth would typically lead to a fall in inflation expectations. So the real purchasing power you'd get from those bond coupon payments should actually go up. And so you'd see this inverse correlation between stocks and bonds. And that persisted for about the past 20, 25 years to a degree that going back, 150 years, never had that strong of a negative correlation between stocks and bonds. And then this year, completely reversed. So if you've been investing for any length of time, you were probably shocked by that. And I went into a lot more detail on why in that playlist that's up on the new YouTube channel when I was giving the investing in inflation talk in January of this year. But yeah, if you don't understand that, then you have no hope of understanding anything else, because that's really the defining characteristic of this new inflation regime.
Okay. So what is your outlook going into next year?
Oh man, I feel like I need to warm up into that one. There's a lot to try to wrap your head around. So I think one of the big questions right now is, how high do rates go? And when does inflation come down? And those two are really tied. The root cause of all of this is inflation. That's the new regime. So to get one's head wrapped around outlook, one has to have a view on inflation. My view is that because rates have risen so fast, and housing is such a sensitive component of the economy to interest rates, and because housing is such a large part of the economy, and because macroeconomic data that the Fed is looking at is quite questionable, given how big these numbers are, how fast things are changing, how difficult it is to measure things like GDP and inflation accurately in terms of what you're really trying to get at. All of these things are indicating to me that we're going to have a recession faster than the Fed seems to be indicating, certainly by Jerome Powell's comments yesterday. So this should put a bit of a damper on inflation, even though there are a lot of factors driving inflation, which in my view is quite entrenched. So I would expect that the Fed's probably going to need to stop hiking rates faster than they anticipate right now, and that this will probably cause investors to be a bit more excited about long duration assets. But I don't expect that to be something that persists for very long. And the reason why is because, well, one, I think that this coming economic environment is going to be quite challenging, because you're still going to have higher inflation. It's going to come down, but it's not going to come down to 2%. It's going to come down to something more like maybe 5 or 6. And once there's some recognition of that, then that's when I think it becomes more challenging for investors. And that's when I think that's when you start to see longer term inflation expectations start to become unhinged. And that's the thing that the Fed doesn't want. And I think that the Fed's doing a great job. I think Jerome Powell's doing a great job in terms of trying to mitigate it, given the tools that he's got. Great might be, I don't know. I want to be very supportive of the folks at the Fed, because I think that they're definitely doing the best they can in an extremely challenging environment. And so what I'm really saying is, I don't think that, me or most anybody else that comments in the Fed, I don't think that they could do a better job, is really what I'm saying. I think it's very challenging. But I think part of the reason why it's so challenging is because ultimately the Fed isn't what's driving inflation, and they only have the ability to influence, they can't control.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think ultimately the real control at this point for inflation rests with the ability of the federal government to balance the budget. And that I don't see happening anytime soon, because it seems to me that there's a real breakdown in the ability of the two political parties, Democrats and Republicans, to come together and enact policy that simultaneously balances the budget while also helping to boost productivity and provide equal opportunity to Americans. And until that happens, you're going to continue to see inflation rise, because the government is spending more and more money as a percent of GDP. That money, because it's being spent by the government, it's generally not very productive spending. It's crowding out the private sector, which tends to create much more productive spending. And you're seeing more and more spending that seems to be designed more to cater to voters than to actually trying to solve real problems. And I'll give two examples from either side of the aisle. One would be Democrats pushing for forgiving college debt at a time when really anything that the government can do to try to not spur spending would be way more helpful. But then under the Trump administration, declaring an emergency and using FEMA funds to erect a wall against Mexico, when in the process all they really did was build roads in order to get the equipment in, so it made it easier for them to traverse across the desert. And these walls are like falling apart. And that's just two of many examples I could give. But this breakdown in the federal government able to balance the budget has been going on basically since it really started to get bad right after the financial crisis, during the financial crisis, and in response to that event. And you can actually see it in a chart. That's actually, could you pull up the newsletter?
Yeah.
There is a chart in there put out by Bridgewater that illustrates when this regime started to change. And for about 14 years, the federal government was able to spend more money than it could sustainably keep spending. And you can just pull that up whenever you're ready. And the private sector, which used to own the vast majority of this debt, started to scroll down, started to decouple from the amount of government spending. Actually, no, it should be higher than this. It's the other one by Bridgewater. No, it's the other one by Bridgewater that has the, yeah, keep going down, down.
I think these two are the same one. Might have to switch that.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll need to switch that. So this other chart basically shows a dislocation where it used to be the private sector that was filling that spending. And once they stopped around 2008, the Federal Reserve continued what was essentially a perpetual quantitative easing program. And that program essentially meant that they were going to buy government debt and put it on their balance sheet. So the Fed ended up providing a stopgap for government spending that was not being supplied by the private sector. Not surprisingly so, interest rates were extremely low. So government bonds were not attractive. That's also why the prices of stocks kept going up, because you could have a dividend yield of only 1%, and that looked pretty good when treasury bonds were only yielding 1%. And so given that differential, that's really what explained how the government could keep spending money without working effectively together. And during that time, you've seen just a continual increase in partisanship. And it started to get really scary lately with, for example, the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, and just a continual, almost exponential rise in threats against politicians, threats against individuals that are, part of our democracy, helping to facilitate elections, the pervasiveness of lies and just completely unfounded beliefs about Trump winning the 2020 election, for example, QAnon, this especially, and I'm going to go ahead and call out, where a lot of this problem is concentrated on the far right. This is very problematic. You don't see leaders in the Democratic Party saying that they're not going to give up their politically appointed position or their elected position if voters decide to vote them out. That's coming from the far right. And that's something that we haven't seen in this country since before the Civil War, back in 1861. That's when that started. So if you can't have a government that knows how to work together and balance a budget and is demonizing and increasingly attacking one another, then you can't balance the budget. And if you can't balance the budget, then you're going to continue to see dollars flowing in to the economy that are being used in an unproductive way. And so we won't have the productive capacity to produce the goods and services that are being demanded. And that imbalance is ultimately what's driving inflation. So in terms of outlook into the next year, and frankly beyond, the real long-term expectation for me is that Americans need to come together before we can solve this inflation problem. And frankly, I don't really see a near-term catalyst that's going to help make that happen. How's that? Is that uplifting enough for you?
That certainly is very
feel free to react to that. I mean, part of the reason why I'm grateful to have you here is that I think you can ask some of the questions that somebody watching this may be having, because I've got a lot going on up here. That's why I'm trying to structure my thinking in these newsletters, and I plan on doing a lot more with you and other members of the learning community. But if any of that didn't seem like it quite connected with you, feel free to push back on me.
Well, I do think it does make sense that it's just like, if you're in a position where you're trying to help reduce inflation, then you don't want money flowing into the economy. So I think one thing that might be on people's mind is like, well, there's balancing the budget, but then there's also other things going on in the world, like the war in Ukraine, and then China and Taiwan, and other things that are kind of disrupting everything between countries, that could also be influencing inflation. And then one other question might be just like, other than balancing the budget, what is kind of like the hierarchy of things influencing inflation as well, that might kind of also, if you can solve some things, and like, how would that influence all that?
Yeah, sure. And while I'm doing this, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the new YouTube channel and bringing up just the beginning of that inflation and investing implications video.
I don't think we.
Yeah, it's in a new playlist there. So that
Oh,
way
okay.
folks that are listening can get the more in-depth version of this, which I went into back in January. Because there are a lot of drivers. So one driver is, well, I'll start with some of the drivers that are more transitory, because there are transitory aspects to this. One is the impact of the pandemic on the labor market. So locking people down in their homes and telling them not to go to work, even for 6 months, would have a pretty big impact on the supply of labor. Yeah, that's it. So you can go to the WEquil Capital YouTube channel, and I went through a lot of these in detail. That was a 42 slide deck that I walked through. So you can take that down. So this is a big reason why we've got this hole in the labor market that's driving wage inflation. That's also why you're seeing wage inflation now happening much more in less skilled service jobs. Those are the ones that got hit hardest. And for folks that maybe were in any way struggling, to have that period of time to be out of your routine can have real severe psychological impacts on an individual. And this really isn't a slight against those people at all. I mean, I have a lot of compassion for folks that I know personally that during this pandemic struggled in a lot of different ways. A lot of people gained weight. That was difficult. A lot of people started abusing drugs. A lot of people felt isolated and got cut off from their families. And so, we're still suffering from this. A lot of people are suffering from this, and it takes a lot longer to kind of rebuild after something like that. But we are rebuilding. It's slow, but you can still hear stories of people on podcasts or NPR sometimes when I'm out driving, and just hearing people kind of getting back to normal, some degree of normal, and just being around people and just finding forgiveness for some of the more extreme behaviors that coincide when people are under extreme levels of stress. So I think that that's something that's good. Unfortunately, that's also coinciding with a breakdown in supply chains that are running through China that are unlikely to reverse until he's out of power. And there are a number of reasons for that. But like one thought experiment might be, like if he were to come out and say right now that he wanted to reverse course in terms of essentially firing missiles over Taiwan and putting a de facto embargo and threatening to invade a neighboring friendly democracy, these are reasons why these kinds of things, this rhetoric and those actions are part of the reason why Tim Cook of Apple pulled all of Apple out of China. And Apple had been in China for more than 2 decades. So even if the Communist Party came out and said that they wanted to go back to the way things were, you're going to have to convince business leaders of that. And that's very difficult when you have somebody who's clearly consolidated power around themselves, written themselves into the Constitution, and removed anybody, including the former leader of the CCP, Hu Jintao, from being a threat, from taking away his power. So it's trust is a difficult thing to rebuild. And at this point, I think that a lot of business leaders have learned that when you do business with a country that's controlled by one person, anything can happen, and that's an enormous business risk. And it's just not worth it. Not when you're talking about trying to shave points on a cost curve. It's just not worth it. So that's reversing, and that's going to take years. But there are opportunities created by that too. Like some of the best performing stock markets in the emerging world just so happen to be in the same time zone as the United States. I'm talking about Argentina, Brazil, And you know, because we've hired people in Latin America and had a great working relationship, because there really isn't that same disconnect that we used to have before the pandemic. A lot of the developed world, most everybody, even one's 90-year-old grandmother, had to find a way to stay connected. And so we've learned to use the technology that lets us build relationships and create value around the world. And it's slightly more convenient if they're in the same time zone. And so there are opportunities created by that. We have to realign global supply chains such that they're friendly nations trading with friendly nations. And that's going to take time. It's going to take years. Mm-hmm. And I'm only through 2 out of about 6 or 7 different big forces driving inflation. So if this is news to anybody, or if you want more details on that, check out the WEquil Capital YouTube channel. I walk through these in detail, but essentially everything that was working for keeping inflation low and predictable has reversed itself in just the past, well, ever since the trade war started. That was about 5 years ago, about a year into the Trump administration. And then it's just really gone downhill with Xi taking over and becoming the first leader of the CCP, and really China to bypass the 2-term limit since Mao.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you see the upcoming election playing into your outlook?
I think we're going to learn more about how resilient the democracy of the United States is. And I'm a huge, as you know, supporter of freedom and democracy. I'm an outspoken supporter of democracy everywhere. And I think that this is going to be a real challenge, but I think we'll get through it. There are a number of terms that I've used in previous newsletters, and I'll write more about this soon. But Ray Dalio talks about the long-term debt cycle. The Bible talks about Jubilee. And then there are other authors, I can't remember their names offhand, but the fourth turning is a social psychology theory that talks to the experience of societies that have gone through many decades of wealth and prosperity, but then end up becoming complacent and frankly rather childish in terms of how they handle disagreements, because they've forgotten how bad things can get. Our greatest generation is no longer around to remind us of the struggles to survive the Great Depression and to fight off the Nazis and the Japanese that attacked us unilaterally to kick off our involvement in World War II. And when you go through tragedies, really severe tragedies like this, they tend to bring a culture and a country and together. And ever since the end of World War II, we've been on a downhill track in terms of our ability or our willingness. I shouldn't say our ability. We could turn a lot of these problems around almost immediately if we wanted to, but our willingness to cooperate and see past what are often petty differences of opinion compared to the ability to believe what we want and share our views without being attacked in our home with a hammer. So it might take a few more hammers to the head of the American people before we realize that we're hurting ourselves so badly and that this is a self-inflicted wound. I think that this and every election that we have until we start to pull ourselves out of this through enough pain is really just going to be a test of our resilience. There are some things that make this different than the last time, and of course the time before that being the Civil War, and the time before that being the Revolutionary War. And no, it is not a coincidence that these co-inspired or transpired at roughly the same time that the people that survived those periods died of old age. one thing that's very different is technology, the software revolution, and the ability of people to learn for free, like you and your sister, to use the internet in ways that help us to augment our minds in beautiful ways. But at the same time, telecommunications technology has also created a tremendous amount of fragmentation. And there's plenty of evidence, and plenty of folks like Balaji have talked about the impact of that in terms of creating echo chambers through machine learning models. But then there's also another kind of fragmentation that I've been thinking about more recently, which is the impact of telecommunications technology on allowing those that have the resources and the wherewithal to concentrate in cities with other people that are the real, the risk takers, those that are very curious and confident and ready to explore the world and take on new challenges. And these do end up being the capitalists that make the investments that drive growth and innovation. But it's a very small percent of the population that tends to do that. It's on a curve. Most folks are very comfortable staying in their hometown, just doing what they did growing up, and they don't feel compelled to explore or really push themselves, which is fine. But what's changed is that, unlike pretty much all of human history, people didn't move away from their hometowns. It's kind of like The Hobbit, when Samwise Gamgee is with Frodo Baggins and they get close to the edge of a field, and Samwise looks up at Frodo and he's like, if I take one more step, I'll be further from home than I've ever been. Right? It's almost like Tolkien was speaking to the human race and talking about the power of going beyond our comfort zone. It's called a comfort zone for a reason. It's uncomfortable when we go beyond it, right? And most people don't want to do that. But telecommunications technology made it a lot easier for people to do that, because you could use the internet and telephones. And also, like in the 1980s, there was a big shift in federal government regulations that allowed for companies to be spread across states, including banks. It was a big part of my previous work in like understanding the history of banks and systemic risks, right? Well, these banks became huge because of changes in legislation. And so all of a sudden, the curious and the confident, the innovators and the creators, they could just go. And a lot of them ended up wanting to be around other people like that. And so they started
Silicon Valley.
Yeah, Silicon Valley, Boston, Washington, D.C. is another one. And so when you have that small percent of society leaving Middle America, which frankly, like that, there aren't a lot of hubs like that in Middle America. And that's also where you see a lot more of the Republican Party, mind you. Then you end up getting this situation where you fragmented out a lot of the folks that could be the innovators sort of lifting up some of these communities. And it's kind of like visiting my hometown in Winfield, Iowa. It just seemed so lacking of energy and life. There wasn't really much going on. And it made me want to go home and volunteer at the school and like help inspire some of these kids, But we don't have programs like that. Like that would be a really amazing program, to take folks that had retired from some professional, successful career and give them an incentive to do what their heart might tell them to do, which would be to go back home to their hometown and try to inspire some young person to create a business or write a book like Isla did and published on Kindle. Like that's cool, So that's something we're fighting against right now, because I think a lot of people in small town America feel left behind, but they weren't really left behind by a political party. I think they were left behind because of technological innovations that allowed the curious and the confident creators of the country to seek out adventure and fortune, but in the process, we ended up fragmenting the country. And I don't know how we get out of that, because I think that there is something to being in person. I don't think it's enough to just listen to a Lex Fridman podcast, from Winfield, Iowa, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, I'm ready to explore machine learning implications. Like, what do you think about that? That's a recent theory of mine I might write about. What do you think?
Well, there's also like the culture of those places, and you can hear kind of about why you should want to be a innovator and creator from some podcasts, but then it's a completely different thing to have the people around you actually being creators and innovators, right? Because if you kind of just have that culture around you, then it just you can see it happening around you, and that also makes it easier to see that within yourself, because then it's not like some foreign thing, but it's like, oh yeah, I'm just doing what everyone else is doing. And then and then there's also kind of like, because of the difference in culture like that, then that becoming even more exacerbated on social media, because then you're kind of coming in from that, and then with the machine learning platforms kind of amplifying it even more. So
Yeah, and the people that use those, like Elon Musk was on Twitter, this is before he bought it, long before, telling folks that are using it to not use the machine learning algorithm.
yeah.
And that's something that he would do. He's one of those innovators, clearly. But if you're just using it for entertainment, which it seems like maybe it gives you some degree of entertainment, but really for the vast majority of people, it just makes them depressed. You're using that algorithm. And so I think the technology here is extremely powerful, but the way that power is manifesting itself basically is taking those that have their head in the right place and oftentimes more resources, maybe better role models around them. Families from backgrounds where they were getting a good education, that kind of support, can use these technologies to do like what you and your sister are doing. And then for, I think, most everybody else, it's hurting them. And that, I think, is the driver. Like, I'm not really angry at these poor people that attack the Capitol and these deranged people that still think Trump was supposed to be president, even though he clearly lost. And there are a lot of crazy conspiracy theories out there, QAnon being just one, but there's just a lot. And I think that breakdown is one that has a lot of complex causes that are really tearing at the fabric of our democracy, but are fundamentally driven by technology and not because anybody had it in their mind to try to hurt anybody. And so, hopefully the innovators out there that are watching can maybe be part of this discussion and think of ways that we can try to leverage this technology to help rather than hurt. And of course, WEquil Group is trying to do that, but we're a very tiny organization. This is very much what we're trying to do, right? And WEquil Capital being the most recent addition to that in terms of adding a learning community centered around learning by doing that is really available to anybody. You don't have to be living in Boston or DC or some fancy pants place with high property values to join a free learning community that's on the internet, but still giving people the opportunity if they want it. I think that's part of this, is making education easily accessible and free for the most part, to anybody willing to invest in themselves. So I definitely think education should be a part of this, but we also need leaders to help fund and and support that kind of environment and really lead from the top. Another reason why I single out Republicans is I was listening, Mom and I were listening to Barack Obama give a speech last night. And I could have easily sat down next to any 5-year-old kid and felt very comfortable hearing him talk about the need to treat each other with courtesy and respect and not act like a bully on the playground where if you don't get your way, you're like, oh, get in a fight or like smack somebody or tell the other person that they cheated. Oh, that's why I lost. You cheated. Which is very much how Trump is acting, like a little child. But then we put on some of these talking heads on Fox News, and they were looking at the same speech that Biden gave, talking about the need for us to be civil, and just twisting everything and making him out to be a demon. And of course, if you teach people, if you go around saying that other people are evil all the time, they're going to start to think that they're evil. And a democracy can't function if the leaders are going around saying that the other person's the enemy. There are real enemies out there. One is Putin. There's an enemy. Another one is global warming. There's another enemy. Another one is our own insecurity and some of the challenges that we're still having post this pandemic, and trying to build ties back together between our families and friends and loved ones and rebuilding ourselves. And that's there's plenty of work to do. It's a long-winded answer to your question. The coming election, I'm a little nervous about it.
Well, how are you positioning for this outlook?
So one of the things that I'd really like to do more of is, rather than pushing my investments on Twitter, to have a learning community on your app, although I'm a co-founder too, but you've really driven this, to have a group of adults primarily, although we also have some teenagers, that really want to learn how to invest and use this process of learning by doing to do it. So I'm happy to share my views on securities and positioning, but I'd prefer to do that in an environment focused on learning and in the context of writing quality research with those that are willing to put in the work. And so I don't plan to charge for those that are willing to do that. But part of what I want to offer is more transparency into details about what I'm thinking in terms of securities and portfolio management, risk management, looking at high conviction opportunities. That's a big part of investing. But I think that there's too many investors out there, especially I see it on Twitter, where it's just like an almost obsession with trying to find some, knock it out of the park, I'm going to get rich quick kind of mentality. And frankly, I think that's one of the problems caused by the pandemic, is a lot of people learned a lot of bad habits. And so I kind of want to have the cake on the app. So if you want to come eat some cake, go to the app store and download WEquil app and come say hi to Mr. WEquil. I'm ready to meet you and learn more about what you're doing and teach you how to do this for real. But don't be surprised if it's a lot like working out or eating right, because it takes work. And if you want to get better at investing, you need to write. You need to have a view, and then you need to do research to substantiate your view. And then make a forecast, list out the risks to your forecast, and then reflect back on your investments to see whether or not you were right or wrong. And if you're wrong, make sure it was because of a reason that you listed in the risks. And if you're not doing that, you're just playing around. You're not really investing. You're playing a game like Monopoly or you're gambling in a casino, which is fine. Lots of people like gambling. But if you actually want to be good at investing, it takes a tremendous amount of work. So, that's for the few and the proud. So yeah, I'm happy to engage and talk about positioning for the coming year, but I'd prefer to do that with those that deserve it. Otherwise, I'll just keep this to entertainment on YouTube value. What do you think? Should we wrap it up?
Sure. I mean, I'm really excited to just keep learning about, as you said, kind of the more educational side of it. Obviously, I'm just 13, so I'm not like super interested in like, I'm gonna make money. But but yeah, it just kind of learning about investing, as you've said before, is just a great way to learn about everything. So
well, I've been really impressed with you, obviously, for years, but hiring you a professional team to help drive your app, and then taking my ambition, which for many years has been to do something like WEquil Capital and mirror it off of what you've done with WEquil School. I think that says about as much as any father could say to a daughter about how impressed I am and happy to follow in your footsteps. So really looking forward to doing more research with you. This is going to be an absolute pleasure, and it'll be mine.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Take care.